The wall stands at the northern edge of the world, a monument so ancient that the truth of its creation has dissolved into legend, so massive that men standing at its base feel like insects, so mystical that its very existence defies the natural laws governing stone and ice and time. For 8,000 years, this barrier of frozen water has divided the realm of men from the lands of winter, stretching 300 miles from coast to coast, rising 700 feet into the cold northern sky, thick enough at its base that a dozen mounted knights could ride abreast along its icy roads. But the wall is more than mere ice and stone. It represents humanity's greatest act of desperation, born in the darkest night the world has ever known, constructed through methods that modern builders cannot fathom, maintained by an order of sworn brothers who have guarded the realms of men for millennia. To understand the wall is to understand the very nature of fear and courage, of memory and forgetting, of the price that must be paid when the long summer ends and the winter comes howling from the north with cold that can freeze a man's breath in his lungs and darkness that hungers for the warmth of human life. The story of the wall begins not with its construction, but with the horror that made its construction necessary. 8,000 years before the current age, before the Andals crossed the narrow sea, before even the first men had fully settled the continent, the world knew a summer that lasted a generation. Children were born, grew to adulthood, and had children of their own without ever seeing snow. The land was warm, the harvests abundant, and humanity flourished in the golden glow of endless daylight that seemed as if it would last forever. But seasons in this world are not like those in other lands. Here, summer and winter can persist for years, even decades, and the longer the summer, the longer and harder the winter that follows. The great summer that had blessed an entire generation was building a debt that would have to be paid, and when payment came due, it arrived with interest that nearly destroyed all life in the known world. The winter that followed became known as the Long Night, though night is too gentle a word for the darkness that descended upon the world. This was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of something far more terrible. A generation passed and winter deepened. Another generation died in the cold, and still the snow fell, still the darkness held. The sun became a dim memory, appearing only briefly before vanishing again behind storm clouds that seemed to have no end. Crops failed, animals died, forests froze solid, the seas turned to ice. But far worse than the cold and darkness were the things that came with them. From the frozen wastes beyond the edge of human civilization, from the lands of always winter where no living thing had dwelt in human memory, they emerged. The others, the White Walkers, the cold gods of ancient legend, made flesh and ice and unnatural life. They came riding on dead horses, wielding blades of ice that shattered mortal steel, bringing with them storms and darkness and a cold that went beyond temperature into something supernatural, something that froze the soul as much as the body. The others were not content merely to kill. They raised the dead to serve them, transforming corpses into blue-eyed whites that felt no pain, knew no fear, and existed only to destroy the living. Every person they killed became another soldier in their army. Every village they destroyed provided more troops for their inexorable advance. They swept south like a tide of winter, and before them, humanity broke and fled and died in numbers beyond counting. The first men, who had dwelt in the land for thousands of years, had never faced such an enemy. Their bronze swords and wooden shields, which had served well against human foes and wild beasts, proved useless against creatures that could freeze a man with a touch, that could shatter steel with blades of ice, that commanded armies of the dead. Entire kingdoms fell. Cities were emptied, the living huddled in whatever shelter they could find, burning everything they possessed just to keep the darkness at bay for one more night, knowing that eventually the fires would go out and the cold would claim them too. In this darkest hour, when it seemed humanity would be extinguished entirely, heroes arose. Their names have been lost to time, Or perhaps they never had names, only the title that history has given them. The last hero, they called the greatest of them, the one who would not surrender, who would not accept that this winter was the final winter, that this darkness was the eternal darkness. The last hero took 12 companions, the finest warriors and wisest counselors, and set out into the frozen wastes to find some way to stop the advance of winter. The journey was a nightmare beyond imagining. The last hero and his companions rode through lands that had been transformed into alien hellscapes of ice and death. The cold was so intense that their swords shattered from the temperature alone. Their horses died one by one, freezing where they stood. The companions died too, claimed by cold or whites or the others themselves, until the last hero rode on alone, the only one still living, still fighting, still refusing to give up hope. What the last hero found in the frozen north, what knowledge or power or desperate alliance enabled humanity's survival, the histories do not clearly say. Some tales suggest a magical discovery. Others speak of aid from the children of the forest, the ancient non-human inhabitants of the land who possess their own deep magic. Some whisper of deals made with forces better left unnamed, prices paid that could never be repaid. Whatever the truth, the last hero returned, and with the knowledge or power he brought back, humanity made its final stand. The battle for the dawn was fought in the east, where the great peninsula reaches toward the rising sun. There, the forces of life and death, fire and ice, met in conflict that determined the fate of all living things. The details of that battle have faded into myth. Did dragonfire turn back the tide of winter? Did the children of the forest lend their ancient magic to the cause? Did heroes of legend wield weapons of light against the darkness? The stories disagree, each claiming different saviors, different weapons, different sacrifices. What is known, what cannot be disputed, is that somehow humanity prevailed. The others were driven back to the frozen waste from which they had emerged. The long night ended. Dawn came at last, and with it, the survivors faced a terrible question: how to ensure this horror never happened again. How to prevent the others from returning when memory faded and a new generation grew soft in the warmth of summer. The answer was Brandon Stark, called Brandon the Builder, the legendary founder of House Stark and the architect of marvels. Brandon had been among the heroes of the Long Night, had perhaps been the last hero himself, though the stories are unclear on this point. He understood that memory fades, that humans forget even the most terrible truths when enough time passes. He knew that eventually people would doubt the stories, would think the Long Night merely exaggerated legend, would grow careless. And when they grew careless, the others would return. So Brandon conceived a monument that could never be ignored, a barrier that would stand as eternal reminder and eternal defense. He would build a wall of ice from sea to sea, so tall that no man could scale it, so strong that no force could breach it, so obviously unnatural in its construction that future generations could never doubt that something terrible lay beyond it. The wall would be both shield and warning, both fortress and memorial. The construction of the wall represents perhaps the greatest mystery in the history of the known world. Modern builders examining its structure cannot explain how it was made. The ice is harder than stone, denser than any natural ice has any right to be. It does not melt in summer, does not crack in winter. It supports its own impossible weight through principles that defy understanding. More than 700 feet tall, 300 miles long, thick enough that buildings have been constructed within it. No human labor force, working with any known technology, could have created such a structure. Brandon the Builder had help, that much is certain. The children of the forest, masters of magic that humans could barely comprehend, contributed their power to the construction. Some tales speak of giants, enormous beings of tremendous strength, moving the massive blocks of ice into place. Others mention spells and enchantments, magic woven into the very structure of the wall, protection beyond the physical barrier that would keep certain things from passing. The wall is not merely ice. It is ice and magic, combined in ways that the modern world has forgotten how to achieve. The construction must have taken years, perhaps decades. Thousands of workers would have been required, laboring in conditions that would kill ordinary men. The ice was quarried from frozen lakes and rivers, shaped through methods unknown, transported through means unexplained, lifted to heights that should have been impossible without machinery that would not be invented for millennia. Every inch of the wall's 300-mile length, every foot of its 700-foot height, represents human determination and supernatural assistance working in concert to create something that would endure. But even as the wall was built, Brandon understood that a barrier alone would not suffice. The wall needed defenders, men who would watch and warn, who would stand guard through the long years when nothing threatened, so that when danger came again, someone would be ready to meet it. And so, concurrent with the wall's construction, Brandon and the other heroes of the Long Night established an order of warriors who would be dedicated solely to the defense of the realm against threats from beyond the wall. The Night's Watch was born from the survivors of the Long Night, men who had seen the horror, who knew what lurked in the frozen wastes, who understood that vigilance was not optional, but essential to humanity's survival. These were not merely soldiers, but sworn brothers, men who would pledge their entire lives to the defense of the wall, who would take vows that would bind them until death, who would give up all other loyalties, all other obligations, to serve as the shield that guards the realms of men. The original vows were simple and absolute. The Night's Watch would take no wife, for families create divided loyalties. They would hold no lands, for property creates personal interests separate from the common good. They would father no children, for inheritance creates dynasties that place family above duty. They would wear only black, marking themselves as dead to their former lives. They would be the watchers on the walls, the sword in the darkness, the shield that guards the realms of men. They would live and die at their post, and their watch would not end until death released them from their oath. In the beginning, joining the Night's Watch was the highest honor a man could achieve. The original brothers were heroes, survivors of the Long Night who had proven their courage in humanity's darkest hour. They were granted the gift, a massive stretch of land south of the wall that would provide resources and supplies for their order. Local lords were required to support the watch, to provide food and equipment and men to replace those who fell in service. The Night's Watch was seen as absolutely essential, and all of Westeros understood that supporting them was not charity, but necessary investment in continued survival. The wall itself became the Watch's home and fortress. Along its 300-mile length, 19 castles were constructed, each one designed to house hundreds of brothers and serve as a strongpoint from which patrols could be sent into the wild lands beyond. These castles were not built for comfort, but for function and defense. They were constructed of the same black stone that Brandon the Builder had used for Winterfell, resistant to weather and time, designed to endure for thousands of years. Castle Black, the largest and most central of these fortifications, became the headquarters of the Night's Watch. Here, the Lord Commander kept his seat. Here, the ravens were sent and received. Here, the records were kept and the strategies planned. The castle sprawled across multiple acres, containing barracks for hundreds of men, training yards for combat practice, stables for horses, armories for weapons, storage for provisions, a great hall for communal meals, and the rookery where the ravens that served as messengers were maintained. But Castle Black was only the beginning. East Watch by the Sea guarded the eastern end of the wall where it met the Bay of Seals. This castle served as the Night's Watch's port, maintaining a small fleet of ships that could patrol the bay and provide transportation for rangers who needed to travel by sea. The castle's position made it crucial for trade and communication with the south, as supplies could be shipped by sea far more efficiently than they could be transported overland through the harsh northern terrain. The Shadow Tower stood at the western end of the wall, where the mountains created natural barriers that funneled any approach into narrow passes that could be easily defended. This castle was commanded by men who understood mountain warfare, who could fight in the treacherous terrain where the wall met the frost fangs. The Shadow Tower's position made it the first line of defense against any threat coming from the northwest, and its garrison had to be ready to deploy rapidly into the mountains to intercept invaders before they could reach the wall proper. Between these three major strongpoints, 16 other castles were scattered along the wall's length, each one positioned to provide overlapping fields of observation and to ensure that no section of the wall went unwatched. Deep Lake, Queensgate, Oakenshield, Woodshaw, Sable Hall, Rhymegate, Long Barrow, Torches, Greenguard, Icemark, Night Fort, Deep Lake. Each castle had its own character, its own strategic purpose, its own history of service and sacrifice. The Night Fort was the oldest of all the castles, built by Brandon the Builder himself, or so the legends claimed. For thousands of years, it had been the Watch's largest fortress, a massive structure capable of housing 5,000 men. The castle was a labyrinth of halls and chambers, with deep cellars that descended into the very foundation of the wall itself. But the Night Fort was also a place of dark legend, site of terrible stories that the brothers told in whispers. It was here that the Night's King had ruled, and the castle carried the stain of his crimes even after thousands of years. The Night's King was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and his story serves as the darkest warning in the Order's history. He had been a warrior of the Watch, a man who had served with distinction, rising through the ranks through demonstrated courage and leadership. When he was elected Lord Commander, none could have predicted the horror he would unleash. But on a ranging beyond the wall, he encountered something that should not exist, something that transformed him from defender into betrayer. The legends say he met a woman with skin as white as snow and eyes like blue stars. The others had been gone for thousands of years by this time, faded into legend, and perhaps he did not recognize what she truly was. Or perhaps he recognized and did not care, already falling under whatever dark enchantment she wove. He took her back to the Night Fort. He proclaimed her his queen, and then, in the ultimate betrayal of everything the Night's Watch stood for, he began making sacrifices to the others, offering his own brothers to the cold gods, ruling the Night Fort as a personal kingdom of terror that lasted 13 years. The Night's King's reign finally ended when the king in the north, a Stark of Winterfell, joined forces with Joramoon, the king beyond the wall, a wildling leader who understood that the Night's King threatened all humanity, not merely those south of the wall. Together, these ancient enemies marched on the Night Fort and brought the Night's King down. What became of him and his corpse queen, the histories do not say. But after his defeat, his very name was stricken from all records, forbidden to be spoken, as if erasing his name could erase the shame of what he had done. The lesson of the Night's King echoed through the centuries. The Night's Watch must never forget its true purpose. The oath-forbidding taking of wives existed not merely to prevent divided loyalties, but to prevent exactly the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed the Watch from within. The brothers were meant to be humanity's shield, but shields can be turned against those they are meant to protect if the hand holding them falters. Eternal vigilance was required not only against external threats, but against internal corruption as well. For thousands of years after Brandon the Builder's time, the Night's Watch remained a vital and honored institution. The wall stood unbreached, its defenses never seriously tested by the others who had prompted its construction, for they did not return. Generation after generation of brothers manned the wall, sent patrols into the lands beyond, and kept watch through the long nights. The defense of the realm became routine, and routine is the enemy of readiness. The Wildlings, the free folk who lived beyond the wall, provided the Watch with a more immediate and comprehensible threat than the half-mythical others. These were the descendants of the first men who had been living north of the wall when it was built, who had refused to submit to any authority, who valued freedom above all other considerations. They were not a unified nation, but hundreds of tribes and clans, sometimes cooperating, more often competing, occasionally uniting under a powerful leader who could forge them into a formidable force. The relationship between the Night's Watch and the Wildlings was complicated by geography and necessity. The Wildlings were not inherently evil, merely different in their organization and values. But they coveted the relatively richer and warmer lands south of the Wall, and they viewed the Watch as invaders who had stolen their ancestral territories and then walled them out. Raids south of the Wall were common, small groups climbing the ice or finding their way through ancient tunnels, stealing food and livestock, sometimes kidnapping Southerners, occasionally just seeking to prove their courage by defying the Wall's defenders. The Watch responded to these raids with rangings, expeditions beyond the Wall to track down the raiders, punish the guilty, and demonstrate that the Wall's protection extended in both directions. These rangings were dangerous undertakings. The lands beyond the Wall were wild and unmapped, filled with hidden dangers beyond merely hostile humans. Ancient forests where the trees had eyes, frozen wastes where nothing lived, mountains where one false step meant death. The rangers who ventured into these lands needed to be the toughest and most skilled of all the brothers. But despite the constant low-level conflict with the Wildlings, the Night's Watch's true purpose, defending against the others, began to fade from immediate concern. Generations passed, then centuries, then millennia, and the others did not return. The Long Night became ancient history, then legend, then myth. People south of the Wall began to doubt whether the others had ever truly existed, whether they weren't merely exaggerated stories about particularly harsh winters and the normal dangers of the frozen north. As the Watch's original purpose faded into the realm of children's tales, the institution itself began to decline. The honor of serving in the Night's Watch diminished as the threat it defended against came to be seen as imaginary. Fewer men volunteered. The noble families who had once considered it an honor to send their sons to the Wall now saw it as a punishment, a place to exile embarrassing relatives or disobedient younger sons. The romantic image of the Night's Watch as humanity's shield began to be replaced by a grimmer reality. It was becoming a dumping ground for criminals and unwanted men. The change happened gradually over centuries. At first, the Watch still received volunteers, though fewer than before. But as the memory of the others faded, the Watch began accepting men who were fleeing justice, offering them the black as an alternative to execution or imprisonment. This was not necessarily dishonorable. Many great brothers had come to the Wall seeking redemption for past crimes. But as more and more of the Watch's recruits came from the dungeons, rather than from noble families seeking glory, the institution's character began to change. The decline affected every aspect of the Watch's operations. With fewer men, some of the 19 castles had to be abandoned. The first to go were the smallest and most isolated, the castles that had never been essential for defense. These fortifications were sealed, their gates locked, their halls left empty to the wind and snow. The remaining brothers were concentrated in the larger, more important castles, but even these began to feel empty as the years passed and the recruitment continued to dwindle. By the time of the current era, only 3 castles remained manned: Castle Black, the Shadow Tower, and Eastwatch by the Sea. The other 16 stood empty, monuments to a more vigilant age, their abandoned halls haunted only by wind and the ghosts of brothers who had served there in ages past. The Night Fort, that ancient fortress where Brandon the Builder himself had supposedly dwelt, was abandoned and became a place of ghost stories, its dark reputation ensuring that no one wanted to garrison there, even when more castles were needed. The total strength of the Night's Watch, which had once numbered in the tens of thousands across all 19 castles, dwindled to fewer than 1,000 brothers. Castle Black, designed to hold thousands, now housed perhaps 700. The Shadow Tower had less than 200. Eastwatch by the Sea, never as large as the others, maintained barely 100 brothers. The gift, that vast territory granted to the Watch to provide resources, lay largely empty, for the Watch no longer had enough men to properly work the land or enough political influence to attract settlers. The quality of recruits declined along with their quantity. While some good men still took the black younger sons seeking purpose, bastards seeking legitimacy, even occasional nobles seeking redemption or adventure, they were now vastly outnumbered by criminals, rapists, thieves, and murderers who chose the wall over execution. The Watch was still bound by its oath to accept any man who asked to join, regardless of his past. But the concentration of criminals and outcasts changed the culture from one of honor to one of survival. Yet, despite all these challenges, despite the decline in numbers and reputation and resources, the Night's Watch endured. The brothers still took the same vows that had been sworn for 8,000 years. They still manned the wall, still sent rangers beyond it, still maintained their eternal vigil, even if the world no longer understood why. The traditions survived even as the institution that sustained them crumbled. The daily life of a brother of the Night's Watch was defined by routine and duty. Each man was assigned to one of 3 orders based on his skills and the needs of the Watch. The Rangers, dressed in black cloaks that allowed them to disappear into shadows and night, were the Watch's eyes and swords. They were the men who ventured beyond the wall, tracking wildlings, mapping the changing lands, searching for signs of larger threats. These were the most skilled fighters, the men who could survive in the wilderness with minimal supplies, who could read tracks in snow and signs in forest. The stewards formed the backbone of the Watch's support structure. They managed the castle's daily operations, maintained supplies, oversaw the preparation of food, handled correspondence, managed the ravens that served as messengers, and performed the 1,000 other tasks necessary to keep the organization functioning. The stewards were not glamorous, but they were essential. An army moves on its stomach, and the Night's Watch was no exception. Without the stewards to maintain supplies and infrastructure, the Rangers would have no base from which to operate. The builders maintained the wall itself and all the structures associated with it. They repaired the castles as weather and time damaged them, maintained the winch system that lifted supplies and men to the top of the wall, carved new steps into the ice when old ones collapsed, and performed the engineering tasks that kept the massive structure viable as a military installation. The builders needed to understand not just construction, but specifically how to work with ice, that strange material that flowed like stone over centuries, that could be shaped through careful application of heat, but would crack and shatter if mishandled. Training new brothers was a constant concern, for most of the men who came to the wall had no military experience beyond barroom brawling. The Watch had to transform criminals and peasants into soldiers capable of defending the realm. This training was rigorous and unforgiving. The master-at-arms drilled recruits in swordplay, archery, and horsemanship until their muscles remembered the movements even when their minds were fogged by fear or exhaustion. Weak men died in training. Lazy men were beaten until they learned discipline. But those who survived emerged as competent fighters, or at least as competent as they could be made. The harsh conditions of life on the wall forged strong bonds between the brothers. In an environment where every man's survival depended on his companions, where the cold could kill a man who wandered too far from shelter, where dangers both human and otherwise lurked beyond the wall, the traditional divisions of Southern society became meaningless. A lord's son and a rapist from King's Landing might share a room, stand watch together, depend on each other in combat. The Brotherhood of the Watch was real and powerful, born from shared hardship and common purpose. The food was terrible, consisting mostly of salt beef, hard bread, and whatever game the Rangers could hunt. Fresh vegetables were luxuries, available only when supply caravans arrived from the south or during the brief summer growing season when the Watch's own gardens could produce. The cold was constant, seeping through even the thickest furs, making every movement require extra effort. The work was backbreaking, whether hauling supplies up the wall, maintaining fortifications, or marching through snow on patrol. Yet there were moments of warmth, both literal and metaphorical. The great hall of Castle Black, warmed by massive fireplaces, became a place of community where brothers gathered for meals and shared stories. The common room, though crowded and smoky, provided refuge from the cold and space for men to form friendships that transcended their former lives. The training yard, despite the brutal nature of combat practice, gave men purpose and the satisfaction of visible improvement in their skills. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch held absolute authority over all brothers in operations. He was elected by vote of all brothers, a democratic tradition that stretched back to the Watch's founding. The Lord Commander served for life, making decisions about deployments, accepting new recruits, managing relations with the realm south of the Wall, and maintaining the Watch's independence from political interference. It was a position of enormous responsibility with minimal resources, requiring diplomatic skill, military competence, and unwavering dedication to the Watch's ancient mission. Throughout the millennia, various Lord Commanders had left their marks on the Watch's history. Some, like the Night's King, were cautionary tales. Others became legends for their wisdom and leadership. There had been Lord Commanders who fought off massive Wildling invasions, others who maintained the Watch through periods of famine and disease, still others who reformed corrupt practices or reinvigorated forgotten traditions. Each one swore the same oath, took up the same burden, and did his best to ensure that the Watch would continue its vigil through his tenure. The election of a Lord Commander was one of the few democratic processes in all of Westeros. Every brother, from the newest recruit to the most senior ranger, had equal voice in the selection. The voting could take days as various factions promoted their candidates and negotiations occurred behind closed doors. Some elections were unanimous, clear choices when one man stood above all others in competence and respect. Others were bitterly contested, requiring multiple rounds of voting before a candidate achieved the necessary majority. Once elected, a Lord Commander's authority was absolute within the Watch, but his power to affect the broader realm was limited by the Watch's declining influence. The great lords of the South might ignore his requests for men and supplies, might dismiss his warnings about threats beyond the Wall, might treat him as irrelevant to their political calculations. A Lord Commander needed diplomatic skill to extract what resources he could from a world that had forgotten why the Watch mattered, while maintaining the morale and discipline of men who had every reason to feel abandoned. The Wall itself remained the central mystery. Modern maesters who examined it could not explain its construction or its survival. The ice should melt in summer, at least partially, but it never did. The structure should crack and fail under its own weight, but it had stood for 8,000 years without significant damage. And there were the strange properties that rangers reported: compasses spinning wildly near the Wall, a subtle sensation when touching the ice that some described as a vibration just below the threshold of perception, and the way that certain creatures seemed unable or unwilling to approach it. The magic in the Wall was real, though what exactly it did and how it functioned remained subjects of speculation. The Meisters, who generally dismissed magic as superstition, had no explanation for the Wall's impossible endurance. The legends claimed that spells had been woven into the ice during its construction, that the children of the forest had bound protections into its very structure, that it was not merely a physical barrier, but a mystical one that could keep certain things from passing. Whether these legends were true, and if so, whether the magic still functioned after 8,000 years, no one could say with certainty. What was certain was that the Wall had never been breached by an organized force. Individual infiltrators had climbed it or found their way through old tunnels, but no army had ever crossed from north to south. The Wildlings had never managed to force the gates or scale the Wall in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the defenders. Whether this was due to the Wall's physical formidability, its mystical protections, or simply the effectiveness of the Night's Watch in defending it, the result was the same. For 8,000 years, the Wall had done exactly what it was built to do. Some brothers whispered of other properties, stranger phenomena that were dismissed as superstition by those who valued rationality above experience. They spoke of the way the Wall hummed during certain phases of the moon, of sections that were colder than they should be even by the standards of frozen ice, of places where the Wall seemed almost alive, as if something vast and ancient was sleeping within the ice. The oldest texts in Castle Black's library mentioned wards and protections, magical barriers that prevented certain creatures from passing, but the details had been lost to time, and the practical knowledge of how such magic functioned had vanished with the children of the forest. The foundations of the wall descended deep into the earth, far deeper than mere structural necessity would require. Some builders who had worked on repairs claimed that the ice went down hundreds of feet, perhaps all the way to bedrock, creating a barrier that extended both into the sky and into the earth. This suggested that the wall was designed to prevent passage not just over it, but under it as well, as if its creators feared enemies that could tunnel through frozen ground or rise from beneath. But as the current era dawned, the situation was changing. Beyond the wall, the Wildlings were uniting under Mance Rayder, a former brother of the Night's Watch who had deserted his post and become king beyond the wall. Mance was gathering the free folk in numbers never before seen, bringing together tribes that had been enemies for generations, forging them into a single massive host. His reasons for this unprecedented unification were unclear to the Watch, but the result was unmistakable. The largest Wildling army in history was preparing to attack the wall. More disturbing were the reports from ranging parties about strange occurrences in the far north. Rangers were disappearing without explanation. Those who did return told stories of the dead walking, of blue-eyed corpses that rose to kill the living, of unnatural cold that descended without warning. The Masters dismissed these reports as superstition and exaggeration, the natural fear of men stationed in harsh conditions and exposed to wildling propaganda. But the brothers who had been beyond the wall knew what they had seen. And what they had seen were the ancient enemies from the long night, the others, the White Walkers, returned after 8,000 years of absence. The Night's Watch found itself facing the convergence of two massive threats, each one potentially capable of overwhelming its depleted forces. The Wildling army numbered in the tens of thousands, a force many times larger than the Watch's total strength. But Mance Rayder was not leading his people south out of conquest ambition. He was fleeing something worse, driving his entire civilization before him in desperate attempt to escape the true threat coming from the far north. The Wildlings understood what the realm had forgotten. The others were real. The long night was returning, and the wall was all that stood between humanity and extinction. Into this crisis stepped Jon Snow, the bastard son of Eddard Stark, who had joined the Night's Watch seeking purpose and place in a world that had no use for bastards. Jon's journey from recruit to ranger to Lord Commander would transform both himself and the Watch, forcing both to confront truths that had been forgotten for millennia. His leadership would be tested by challenges that would have broken most men: the Wildling attack, the mutiny of his own brothers, the political maneuvering of southern lords who saw the Watch as tool rather than treasure, and ultimately the existential threat of the others themselves. Jon's great controversial decision was to offer the Wildlings sanctuary south of the wall in exchange for their help defending against the others. This alliance violated thousands of years of tradition, contradicted everything the Night's Watch had stood for, and enraged many of his own brothers who saw the Wildlings as enemies that could never be trusted. But Jon understood what many did not. The war against the others was not a conflict between humans, but a struggle between life and death, between warmth and cold, between existence and extinction. Every Wildling who died north of the wall would rise as a White to fight for the enemy. Every Wildling given sanctuary was one more sword defending humanity. The decision would ultimately cost Jon his life when brothers who could not accept his reasoning assassinated him in the icy courtyard of Castle Black. But before his death, he had succeeded in bringing thousands of Wildlings south of the wall, had forged alliances that would have been unthinkable a generation before, and had begun preparing the Watch for the true war that was coming. Whether his death was permanent or whether he would return, as some of the strange powers in the world suggested was possible, the impact of his leadership had already changed the Watch forever. The battle for Castle Black tested the Watch's defenses against the most massive Wildling assault in living memory. Mance Rayder's host attacked from both sides of the wall simultaneously, with forces scaling the ice from the north while others attempted to break through the gates from the south. The battle raged for days, with defenders desperately holding their positions against overwhelming numbers. The brothers fought with the courage born of desperation, knowing that if the wall fell, everything south of it would be defenseless against whatever drove the Wildlings before it. The defense succeeded not through superior numbers or firepower, but through determination, tactical intelligence, and the inherent advantages provided by the wall itself. The ice provided killing ground, where attackers were exposed while climbing, where defenders could rain arrows and drop fire on those below, where the sheer physical barrier prevented the application of overwhelming force. The gates held because the brothers fought with the ferocity of men who knew they were protecting not just themselves, but everyone they had ever known. The wall proved its worth once again, demonstrating that 8,000 years of standing watch had not been in vain. The wall stood as it had always stood, 700 feet of ice and magic reaching toward the sky. But the world around it was transforming, and the ancient barrier that had divided humanity for 8,000 years was becoming something different. It was no longer merely a wall keeping dangers out, but a rallying point where humanity would make its stand against the long night returning. Every brother, regardless of his crimes before taking the Black, regardless of his origin or status, became essential to that stand. The great irony was that the wall's ultimate test came not when it was at its strongest, but when it had declined to its weakest point in history. The tiny force of fewer than 1,000 brothers, the abandoned castles, the crumbling infrastructure, the desperate need for supplies and reinforcements that never came, all of these spoke to how completely the realm had forgotten the wall's true purpose. And now, when that purpose was needed most urgently, when the ancient threat was returning exactly as the founders had feared, the Watch was in no position to fulfill its original mission without help that was slow to come and insufficient when it arrived. Yet there remained power in the traditions, in the vows, in the simple, stubborn determination of men who had sworn to stand watch, regardless of the cost. The Night's Watch had endured for 8,000 years, not because of overwhelming strength, but because of absolute commitment. The vows were unbreakable, the duty was eternal, and when everything else failed, when hope itself seemed frozen by the advancing winter, the brothers stood on the wall and kept their watch as they had always done, as they would continue to do until the end of their watch. The wall's future remained uncertain. Would it stand against the coming storm? Would its ancient magics prove sufficient against enemies that had grown strong during their 8,000-year absence? Would humanity rally to defend it, or would political squabbles and personal ambitions doom the realm to the same darkness that had nearly destroyed it during the long night? The answers to these questions would determine not merely the fate of the Night's Watch, but the fate of all living things in Westeros and beyond. But regardless of the outcome, the wall itself would endure as testament to human determination in the face of existential terror. Brandon the Builder had created more than a defensive fortification. He had created a monument to the idea that humanity could triumph over darkness, that civilization could build barriers against chaos, that hope could be frozen into physical form and set as permanent barrier against despair. The wall was made of ice, but it represented something far warmer and more vital: the refusal to surrender, the determination to survive, the absolute conviction that tomorrow was worth defending even at the cost of everything today. And so, the wall stands still, 300 miles of frozen determination, 700 feet of crystallized hope, 8,000 years of accumulated sacrifice. It stands not because it must, but because those who built it and those who defend it believe that what lies beyond it must never be permitted to pass. It stands because somewhere in the frozen heart of winter, in the darkest moment of the longest night, humanity looked at impossible odds and unthinkable horror, and decided that giving up was not an option. The wall is humanity's answer to the others, to the long night, to winter itself. It is 300 miles of defiance expressed in ice. It is the last shield, the final bastion, the monument that proclaims across 8,000 years that humanity does not bow, does not bend, does not break. Not while the wall stands, not while the watch keeps vigil, not while dawn remains possible and brothers remain willing to stand in darkness so that others might see light.